Hello, and welcome to another episode of Climate Watch, where I dive into big questions about climate change and clean energy. I'm Fei Fei. Today's question is, what do tariffs bring to our energy transition? Right now, many countries are either waiting for or actively trying to negotiate tariff terms with the United States. Well, maybe except for China. China's taken a different path in this tariff standoff with the US. We'll dig into that in another episode. But today, I want to focus on how this impacts a global effort. Not just the immediate impacts, like what these countries can buy or the trade deals they might land, but the broader consequences. When the world's largest economy and also a major consumption power keeps shifting its trade policies, it creates a ripple effect. And that ripple can bring real uncertainty to other countries who are trying to green their economies. Take Asia, for example. Countries like Vietnam and Malaysia have both gained and lost from previous US tariffs on solar products from China. And when those tariffs hit last year, something interesting happened. Indonesia became the next destination for Chinese solar manufacturers. The country literally became a kind of safe haven for those companies who are looking for a workaround. So I reached out to Putra Adiguna in Jakarta to learn more about what this latest round of tariffs might mean for the region. Putra is the managing director of the Energy Shift Institute, which is a think tank focusing on Asia's clean energy transition. We also talked about Indonesia's energy transition path. The country is a major coal producer like China. I originally reached out to you to talk about basically your trip to China's coal-producing province of Shanxi, and I plan to talk about, the future of the coal industry and also energy transition as a whole. And then, over the last week or two, the US President Donald Trump kept dropping rounds of announcement of tariffs, not only on China, but also, on the whole world, which will have impacts on energy transition globally. So I want to start off this episode by checking with you on these impacts. I actually read an article by you last year when Donald Trump was elected president. In that article, you wrote that you predicted that there would be policies sort of to bar Chinese-affiliated clean tech products and complicate the landscape for Southeast Asian exporters, and companies that need Chinese investments or Chinese technology or supply chains will face barriers. And that sort of is happening now. So how do you see these policies like tariffs will mean for energy transition in Southeast Asia as a whole?
Yeah, thank you for having me, and thanks for the question, Faye. I think it's a very interesting development. Obviously, nobody would have thought that the level of aggressiveness that is coming from the US policy so far, which is quite surprising. But overall, it is quite interesting to see where it'll go. So if we talk about Southeast Asia's energy transition, like I wrote in that piece, is that for context, right? Since there's a lot of solar tariffs imposed by the US to China, a lot of their solar producer moved to Southeast Asia. So right now it encompasses about 80% plus of US solar import as of last year. Now, with what's happening today, I think it'll become much more difficult for any country to export anything to the US, as we know, right? I mean, whether it's Chinese affiliated or even not Chinese affiliated. And I guess that's the complication. The other part is that for Southeast Asia, for a lot of countries, their establishment of solar producers about 10 to 25 times bigger than their own domestic installations. So what this tells you is that it has been very significant, right? So I guess the next question would be, if all these producers are there and they are practically shut out from their previous market in the US, who can absorb it? And I think this is a big question that will take place in many countries as well. At the same time, as we know that Chinese solar production is also going quite a lot of capacity. So in terms of Southeast Asia, it's really point number one is that they need to find a diversified market for their products, for whatever that they're already producing, right? If you already establish a sole production in Malaysia or Vietnam, they need to try to do better. Secondly, however, we do need to acknowledge that there may not be a market readily available that can replace the US market as big as that, especially if you have to compete with products straight away from China. Point number three, which also is important, is that ultimately they need to develop their domestic demand as well, which means that they need to build up more renewables domestically within the region.
How exactly, for example, in Indonesia, how exactly will the country incentivize local demands? I mean, that's not something that can be done overnight.
That is true, and it's not going to be easy for anyone, right? Let's setting aside Indonesia for now. Even the biggest one, like Malaysia, Vietnam, and Thailand, there will be struggling to where do they going to sell those solar capacity. Now, countries like Indonesia did have a bit of benefit because last year there was already an imposition of tariffs to 4 Southeast Asian countries, and Indonesia was not on the list. However, given where we are today, I think practically all the solar exporters will be shut out from the US market, right? And I think that's just something that we just have to deal with. Now, your question about how do you incentivize domestic demand, you have a very valid point that ultimately it's not easy. The US market is one of the world's biggest market in terms of solar capacity and installations. So I think it will take a lot of competitions. Some businesses will likely downscale their productions or even shut down entirely. I think that's just the way that's going to happen. Incentivizing can take different place in different forms. Some people develops the solar rooftop demand, like what we're seeing a lot in places like Pakistan. In other places, is focused more on bigger scale installations. But again, ultimately, there is an inherent reason why solar capacity growth varies quite widely. Even if you pick up 4 countries, for example, Vietnam, Thailand, Indonesia, and Malaysia, each of these countries, despite being within the same region, they have vastly different policy landscape, market landscape, and others. Now, one bright spot, however, is that we're seeing Singapore as the most affluent countries within the region, expanding aggressively because they want to do a lot of clean energy and they can afford to pay premium prices on electricity. What this does is that it will likely pull ahead, or let's call it nudging the region, right? Because what they want to do is that they want to import a lot of clean electricity, whether it's coming from the neighbors in Malaysia or whether it's coming from Indonesia. So I think that can be a bit of a bright spot within the region.
And that's very interesting, as you mentioned, that most of the solar products produced around the world will be shut out from the US market. And I couldn't help but wondering, what does that mean for US consumers? I mean, does that mean, prices are going up, or do they have to shift to other source of energy?
Yeah, I think, well, obviously Trump wants, oil and gas to kind of grow again and fill up the gap, right? But we come back to economics, right? There's a lot of consumers and industries that adopt solar energy because it becomes the cheapest source of electricity, even in places like the US. Places where traditionally there's a lot of oil and gas, like in Texas, is some of the US biggest producers of solar electricity. Now, to your question, there's actually several layers of what we call the solar value chain, right? Obviously, it's not a single industry. There's multiple layers of industries within it. And I think within the last 3 years, since Biden implemented what they call the Inflation Reduction Act to incentivize solar manufacturing and clean energy manufacturing in the US, there's been a lot of investment, especially on the latter end of the solar manufacturing. It's called the module part of the manufacturing. However, that part may be easier as opposed to the earlier part, where you produce the raw materials to become the material for the solar manufacturing. So I think for the US consumer, it will become difficult. They will, the solar manufacturing there will try to survive as best as they can, but I think it will take time. Even if the US right now can produce some level of solar module manufacturing capacity, the fact of the matter is that it's not easy to expand that production all the way to the raw materials, such as the polysilicon and whatnot. So it's going to take some time. It's going to be expensive for the US consumers, frankly speaking, and it's not going to be easy for anyone.
And also, since you mentioned that definitely the current Trump administration has a plan to expand on the fossil fuel energy part. And I think right now, a lot of countries are sort of trying to negotiate with the US on new terms of trade, including Indonesia, actually. And some will speculate that there will be talks about borrowing these countries from being a stopover for Chinese exports or acting as a base for Chinese companies. And that will definitely include the energy sector, be it renewable or fossil fuels. How would you evaluate the effectiveness of this move? I mean, the purpose of this move is basically driving manufacturing in the US. Do you see it work if it actually got implemented?
Well, it's good on paper, I guess. It's not going to be easy, right? I mean, obviously, it takes decades for the whole world to become where we are today. And a lot of people like to say, one of the advantage of China is, low cost labor. But as we know, it's not as simple as that, right? It's a lot of complicated and complex supply chain. So coming back to your question, obviously at a macro level, there's a big global disarray across many sectors. But let's focusing on energy and let's look at it from at least two lenses, right? The first one is the fossil fuel. Despite whatever the narrative that is playing out in the US, it's not easy to incentivize the US to produce more oil and gas, especially in the world with a weakening economic outlook, right? Now, if we look at that, the US has a minimum amount of cost that they need to recover at their oil and gas producers. If they cannot recover that cost, they're not going to produce more, whatever Washington say to them, right? So I think that's point number one. Now, about the clean manufacturing, again, I think we're reaching that point where many people are waking up to the realities of the overly reliance on Chinese value chain as well. So they're trying to diversify that. But the limit ultimately will take at least two things. Number one is geology, right? And geology also means luck. When you want to build materials, you need specific kind of minerals, for example, whether it's from Democratic Republic of Congo or places like Philippines and Indonesia. That's just geologic luck, right? The second part, it takes a long-term approach, right? You cannot build industries within the span of 2 to 3 years, right? And I think that is the biggest question for the US right now, is that suppose they can bring some level of production in the US. The next question would be, what is the long-term outlook that this policy will remain stable? Because businesses doesn't do decisions on a span of 2 years. Even if, let's say, Donald Trump is within the office for the next 4 to 5 years, what is the guarantee that the policy will remain stable afterwards? I guess this is the big question that is actually happening for businesses that want to reshore or onshore back to the US. They will have that questions, right? Okay, let's suppose I'm going to invest $100 million back to the States. What does the cost of my value chain look like? Will the policy remain stable? Or maybe within the next 5 years, it's going to be open the door policy again. Then it's going to be complicated for everyone. So I guess that's the biggest question for the US.
So do you have any idea how our business reacting at the moment, given this uncertainty ahead?
Are they still investing? Nobody knows, frankly speaking. I think nobody knows. I think some businesses have shown, let's call it a posturing of wanting to invest in the US, rightfully or wrongfully. But I guess a big chunk of businesses would like to wait and see a little bit, because when for example, for the US to impose 100% of tariffs to China, a lot of people and businesses are casting doubt about, will such policy be durable, right? Will that even last the next 12 months? So I think within such an environment, well, nobody knows anything. And frankly, I don't think people in the White House may also know what's going to happen next week. So I think it's going to be interesting. A lot of business will wait and see, at least for some time, because here's where some people like to call it early mover disadvantage, right? I mean, some people that move a bit early may be disadvantaged within the next 12 to 18 months. It's a big risk on the table. So I think a lot of people will wait for some time.
Does that also mean that these companies will slowing down their production? I mean, if at the moment I'm not really sure where my products will go, then the best market decision, I assume, would be to cut down on this production, to cut costs.
Are you referring to clean energy production?
Yeah.
I think so. However, there is a limit to that, right? Because what you're looking at, if we're looking at the clean energy production, there's actually two different factors at the same time. The first one is that even before Trump, China has already a lot of capacity that is underutilized, right? Which means that there is a cutthroat competition across many clean energy value chain. whether we're talking of polysilicon's, module manufacturing, and technology keeps on moving, the batteries and EV. So there's a lot of tight competition that will make sure that there's only going to be the strongest company survive. And that was before Trump came in. Now we got Trump, which kind of like amplifies the volume by a factor of 10, right? So I think companies will try their best to kind of find a balancing point, but ultimately, it is a cutthroat competitive environment. Some companies will survive, others will consolidate, hopefully for the better for everyone, but it's not going to be an easy part.
And that's going to be brutal for smaller businesses in particular. Let's get back to Indonesia, where you come from. Actually, I reached out to you, as I mentioned in the beginning of this podcast, to talk about coal transitioning. I understand that transitioning the coal sector in Indonesia is also one of your priorities of your institute. So give us a bigger picture of exactly what is Indonesia's energy mix at the moment, and what sort of position is the coal in this mix?
So countrywide, about a third of the energy use comes from coal. But if we're looking at electricity, it's somewhere around 60 to 70%. It's coal reliant. And that's where we are. The other part is a little bit of gas, but renewables is still within the, call it the 13 to 15% of electricity. So it's still a small chunk of it. So it's mainly coal reliant.
So it's very similar to China's energy mix, actually, to have about 60% of the mix being coal. And since you are examining the possibility of transitioning the coal sector, how exactly do you have in mind will coal be transitioned in Indonesia?
I think for countries like us, Indonesia, which is the world's largest seaborne coal exporter, transitioning, of course, by definition means you need to pay attention to environmental and social standards of your coal development, right? But secondly is that, comparing to major coal provinces like Shaanxi in China, the one you just mentioned earlier, one thing that we have not seen in Indonesia at scale is that coal is not being used to develop and diversify its industrial development, right? You're essentially a major exporter. So I guess to the question of what does a transition from coal look like, point number one is really making sure that any economic rents that benefit out of the coal exports is actually reinvested within the country. Because if you go to China, you can see that there's a lot of coal consumption, obviously, right? But there's a lot of industries that are being developed outside of coal. That's why you have the clean energy, the batteries, and all these other industries. Today, they may be still reliant on coal as well as hydro and other things. But what this means is that the transition will have to see a lot of reinvestment and diversification for the businesses. And that part we don't just see just yet in places like Indonesia.
So that's basically what phasing out of coal means. It's like gradually diversifying investments and demands of coal to other parts, other energies.
Correct. Because right now, Indonesia grew its coal sector from practically nothing to where we are today, piggybacking on the rise of China's coal demand, right, in the 2000s. Now, as it did so, it also grew this coal addiction because it basically imposed a lot of domestic coal policy. We have things like domestic price cap for coal, which is unfortunate, right? Because it essentially means is that no other energy can compete with it because it's basically there's a policy intervention saying that coal will need to remain under X dollar price at any given time for power generation. And this is a difficult situation because this kind of intervention basically means that no other source of energy can compete. And this is, I guess, one of the things that Indonesia also need to deal with. Because ultimately, today, if Indonesia want to build a new coal power, it probably cannot do so anymore. Right, the global financiers has backed out, right? Even there's a commitment coming from Beijing for not supporting overseas coal financing. So I'd like to say that the door behind us is actually been closed, but a lot of people are not realizing that. They still kind of like hope, well, maybe there's a chance in the future. And I think this is the kind of transition that Indonesia to deal with. It really need to look with a clear eye views, what's happening behind you and what do we need to do to go ahead.
I think it's understandable, people like to stay in their comfort zone. As you mentioned, if for the past 2-3 decades, Indonesia has been comfortably sitting on the rich resources of coal, why would people start to think, diversifying or changing their course when it's so comfortable right now and lucrative right now? So what do you think are the ways for example, for the governments or for the markets to incentivize changes?
Well, number one, pull out the coal intervention price policy, because that's actually an artificial price cap, right? Because what we really need right now is a way to scale up the clean energy investment and having a level playing field, right? Because when you introduce a price cap, that's essentially a coal subsidy, right, being paid by the producer. And it's unfair to see that the coal price is being subsidized while renewables is not. This is a bit of an odd situation because we feel that we're so rich in coal. Now, for context, Indonesia actually only have about 3% of global coal reserve, which is not that lot. I mean, it's not really that much, but because it's a major exporter, it tends to develop that kind of attitude. So number one, pull out the coal price intervention policy. And second, I think what is important for places like Indonesia is that there need to be a stronger narrative and hypothesis to prove that economic development can go hand in hand with a green transition. And for this end, I think what is important for Indonesia is to develop green industries, right? Green industrial zones. So within it, you can develop all kinds of renewables, and you can get access to clean energy and so forth. Right now, we don't have any, frankly speaking. So because in Indonesia, the electricity is basically dominated by a single state-owned utility companies. And it's very difficult to get clean access to electricities because, as a state-owned utility, you have different kind of priorities. Now, the important part about this is that in many emerging markets, it's a hard sell to just talk about climate, right? When you want to talk about transition, you need to talk about jobs. What are the economic benefits and so forth? So the president of Indonesia has this goal that he called, the high quality economic growth, I think quite similar to China. If Indonesia want to achieve high quality growth, it need high quality investments, right? And high quality investors would almost always have some kind of a clean energy target. But then if they want to invest in Indonesia, we need to open up the door, whether it's in one or two industrial zones, but that option need to be open, especially in the highly competitive times like we do today. Now, point number three, however, we still need to acknowledge that there's still a lot of economic benefits coming out of the coal, which means that creating some kind of a funding pool to help the transition will also be necessary, right? We cannot let coal companies getting windfall profits after windfall profits and not reinvesting that money in Indonesia. So that's the big risk also. So we need to kind of bridge the way to the future.
Last year, Indonesia announced their climate goals. They were phasing out of the coal production, and there are also a target for renewable energy. It's surprising to see you talk about that a lot of policy are actually not in place. What policies have been announced since that climate goals have been announced?
So there is a relaxation of local content regulation, which has been helpful to adopt a little bit of solar. But in terms of coal phase out, there is the program that we call an early coal retirement. That's under the JETP, the Just Energy Transition Partnership, and other kind of similar program. It has made some progress, but really in terms of scale, it'll probably be able to do some early retirement of maybe 1, 2, or 3 coal plants. It's not a countrywide early coal retirement. So coming back to your question, that's an interesting observation, is that on the ground, I think what is most important for Indonesia is actually quite simple. Develop a short-term transition plan. Because what we tend to do is that we tend to create this 10-year goal, 15-year goal, and 20-year goal. Frankly speaking, investors don't want to see your 10-year goals. They want to see what's going to come into the pipeline within the next 1 to 2 years. And I think this is one of the Achilles heel of Indonesia, is that there's a lot of big announcements. Unfortunately, within the last 7 years, investment in renewables have been practically flat. And this is a big of a challenge in places like us, right? You see all kinds of conferences spurring up every week, but then your investment remain flat. So to your question, the most important part that Indonesia need to do today is actually develop a very short-term plan, i.e. within the next 12 to 18 months, this is what we're going to do, whether it's to invite Chinese investors, coming from the Europe and others. I think what they want to do is clarity on the near-term targets, as opposed to a 10-year or 15-year plans. And we don't see that just yet.
by that, you mean that not only have that 10-year plan, but better have like a step-by-step action plan to sort of detail what you are going to do over the period of 10 years. I'm also curious about in terms of technology or financial investments. As you mentioned that there's some challenges and hurdles among the policy-making sector. What about on the markets? Are there anything in the private sector happening that's showing promising or having potential at the moment?
So the most promising one so far that we look at is at least two things. Number one is development of solar projects for industrial purpose, which means that you develop a lot of solar rooftop on top of factories that they can adopt, greener electricity in a lot of factories. And that is growing quite rapidly. Now, the second one is the export market that we talk about relating to places like Singapore, because again, there's a lot of interest coming from places like Singapore. So there's a lot of project that Indonesia want to build so they can export a few gigawatt of solar electricity to places like Singapore. Now, one background note is that I haven't mentioned is that Indonesia has quite a significant excess coal power capacity. It basically built too much coal power at the same time the world is transition. So right now we have about 20-ish% of coal power capacity that doesn't get used. Now, in markets like Europe, this doesn't matter so much for the consumers, but in markets like Indonesia, it does, because the state utility essentially have to continue paying even if they don't use those capacity, which means that they're going to end up into the public budget or within the consumer cost. That's quite unfortunate, but that's actually one of the reasons why state utility company is having trouble to transition, because they just have like a 20% excess capacity that they need to pay anyway, whether they use it or not.
Oh, and that's been happening. That money is sort of going down the drain.
Pretty much. We can say that, yeah. So basically, it's a result of, let's call it an inflexible planning, right? So within the last 7 to 10 years, there's a lot of aggressive demand projection growth, which was not realized. Therefore, the state utilities sign on the agreement, which basically say, I'm going to pay you for, let's say, 100 megawatt power plant, whatever comes, right? And now we're in that period, right? I mean, some capacity doesn't get used, but we need to continue paying it. So that's the biggest hurdle that we're facing right now.
Well, I think on the brighter side, that could also, probably, encourage the development of power storage, which is also very hot on the market and also in China at the moment. I'm not sure, but the technologies remains very expensive. Then you went to the province of Shanxi, I would argue, the biggest coal-producing region in China. Is there any inspiring points that you find during that trip?
I think the most inspiring part is to look at the development level that is happening at the coal-rich provinces. Development, at least on two things. The first one, development of economy as a whole, and secondly, also development of other industries within the provinces, right? We do not yet see that in places like Indonesia. Let me give you two examples. In Indonesia, we have at least 2 or 3 major coal provinces that are producing things, but usually they produce it, they put it in the barge or the railway, not much of a development is then taking place within those provinces. So I think it's very interesting to look at how, yes, coal has a lot of emission problem, has a lot of historical issues, but at the same time, in Shanxi, you see that it becomes a leverage point to build other things. While in many of the provinces in Indonesia, all you see is basically an empty coal, open pit coal mines, and that's pretty much it, right? So I think that is something that Indonesia will need to focus on. How do you do a just transition if, let's suppose that when a transition happens, then all these people within these coal-rich provinces doesn't have anything else to rely on, right? So I think we need to start thinking at it from that point.
What exactly has Shanxi been leveraging their coal resources?
I think we're seeing a lot of industrial parks happening within the provinces. A lot of productions of different kinds of products, obviously. Some clean, some are less clean. Some are gray hydrogen. A lot of people doesn't like hydrogen coming from coal. But I think the point is that there's a lot of steel industries, it's all kinds of, derivatives industries that is happening there, which again, it provides you that economic stepping stone for reaching out the future as it changes and when it does changes.
And I think I also saw that in a previous interview of you is that you talked about this gray area of investments or technological development of being a lot of people are talking about green development or green investment, but sometimes it can be too risky or too expensive. And then we can transition with this gray area and sort of step by step achieving the ultimate green goal that we all hope to see one day. So green development of coal is sort of one of the stepping stone and can be very controversial around the world because a lot of people do not believe there is a concept of green coal. They just simply don't believe it. Even though here in China, I think there have been efforts, for example, in carbon capture, CCUS, or other sector to trying to make coal has less of emissions as they used to produce. I'm also curious about your take on this. What exactly is the green coals gonna look like? And are we ultimately will phase out coal 100% in our energy mix in the future?
Yeah, that's a very tough question, Faye, but let me try that. So firstly, when we talk about, obviously, the word green coal for a lot of people is an oxymoron, right? It's a contradictory statement. So there's at least several layers, but let's take a stab onto the carbon capture question. Because ultimately, the biggest problem is the emissions, right? So there's a lot of people saying that, why if we capture the emissions, but how much does it cost? The simplest way that I like to frame it is that if and when you can deploy CCS, carbon capture and storage, then do deploy it. But it's expensive. You're looking at a cost of somewhere between $60 to $200 per ton. Now, to give a bit of an example, not many countries have even $30 of a carbon tax, right? So just think of carbon capture as a carbon tax. So every time you spew up emissions, you need to pay $100 to store that emissions. However, I do think that right now, China is not yet going seriously about carbon capture. I know they're exploring some of the development because it will be interesting to see how much cost decline we can actually see within the carbon capture space. I'm actually going to Beijing within the next few months to speak about some of this topic, which I think is both controversial and complicated, because the reality is there's going to be a lot of coal power for the next 20 to 30 years. What do we do with those capacity? So point number one, if you can deploy CCS at a very cost competitive level, maybe it's an option. Underline the word maybe, because so far the biggest and most aggressive developers has been the American, the European, as well as the Japanese, and they haven't been able to deploy CCS at a cost competitiveness that is required. Maybe China can do it. We don't know. So I think there's going to be some anticipation about that. Now, secondly, if you talk about coal as a green, I'm being careful here not to word it too easily green. I think having coal power that can run more flexibly will be helpful, because ultimately the world today has so much coal power capacity, and as it transitions toward green energy, so we usually what you need to do is that during the daylight you have a lot of solar power. How do you balance it? Usually coal power is not flexible, meaning you cannot turn it on and off easily. But some of the development of more flexible coal power will actually be helpful, because it kind of provide you with that runway as the renewable energy goes up, and then you have the ability to adjust to that. So again, there is no easy answers about green coal development, but I am somewhat hopeful that if China is serious about CCS, maybe there is an inkling of hope there.
Yeah, I've actually heard experts on our show talk about the coal power being sort of a stabler in the whole power grid, as you just mentioned, to sort of helping to stabilize solar and wind power, which often have the problem of not being stable. I hope someday that will happen, probably taking advantage of the current smart technology. Who knows what would happen in the future? And the last question I have for you is about finance. Because when all the technology and the policies and all the projects that we talk about today in this episode all needs money. And money remains one of the top topics for many international meetings. And especially, I think US used to be a key financier of these efforts, especially in green transition and clean tech. And right now, the US is definitely stepping back on this part. What do you see the future of the financial investments going in, for example, in the energy transition efforts?
Right. So good question. So first point is that US, despite being a major country across the world, has never actually been a central throughout the global energy transition, underlining the word global. Obviously, there's a lot of green finance and investment flowing out the US, but other regions has also played a big role as well. Now, I guess the next question is that what's going to happen after all this ESG backlash? People saying ESG doesn't work, Donald Trump is in the office, and other things. In terms of finance, the biggest question really remains, at least one of this, is that how do we direct some of those capital into the emerging markets? And I think it's not going to be easy, especially if you got a little bit of volatility here and there, because emerging markets doesn't have, a low interest rate as, the luxury that can be afforded in many places. But we also need to remember, however, as we go through this energy transition, the logic of the transition is shifting from climate to economics, right? 10 years ago, when people want to adopt solar, it's really climate reasons, what is the carbon price and whatnot. But today, for example, some industries, when they develop, they want clean energy and they can get it cheaper as compared to buying LNG or buying gas from other countries, or even cheaper than importing coal. So I think the economic rationale will ultimately become stronger and stronger as we go ahead, especially if we look ahead within the next 5 to 10 years. You mentioned briefly about storage, right? Obviously, we see the cost decline of the solar and the cost decline on wind, and we're seeing the same thing on storage. So all these coming together will strengthen the economic rationale for installing, cleaner energy. Let's use Pakistan as an example, because that country has a lot of recent solar power installation. We're reaching that point where clean energy is becoming more competitive rather than importing LNGs or importing coal, for example. And I think as that economic threshold is crossed, the finance will flow automatically, because you're really not banking solely on carbon price. You're not relying solely on, for example, ESG-based investments. That is really the economic rationale for the country. The countries are moving at different paces. I think that we need to acknowledge that, Africa, Southeast Asia, East Asia, each are running in different tracks at the same time. But I think the direction of travel is clear. And I think everybody just need to keep a clear view about what's going to happen in the future.
I think what happened with the solar industry in Pakistan has been getting a lot of global tractions, really. A lot of that is helped by Chinese investments. And what role will Chinese investments play in energy transition in the future, given the policies imposed by the US administration, who is sort of trying to stop Chinese investments going elsewhere and expand further?
Right. Current US attempt to decouple China from the rest of the world is unlikely to succeed, right? Obviously, you got two major economies, the US and China. All other countries want to do trade with both partners, right? They cannot decouple entirely from the US or decouple entirely from China. So to your question, the role and the space that China can play is going to grow and grow within the future. It is already the economic powerhouse for the clean transition, right? Today, you have all kinds of companies who want to invest abroad from China, whether you're talking about batteries, electric vehicles, solar, and other technologies, which means that naturally there's a strong interest for China to go and reach abroad. And as the US blocked their entry, their influence, unfortunately, will weaken, at least for the next 4 to 5 years, which means that there's going to be a lot of vacant spaces. If we pull back to China's, carbon peak, carbon neutral target, for example, right? If a country as big as China, with the big coal consumption and all kinds of fossil fuel, is already reaching a plateau on their emissions within the coming decade, the world is already shifting, which means that other countries would want to catch up to make sure they're not going to be left behind. at least you have two main factors here. You have the European Union, which continue, some kind of climate targets, and China, which is also pursuing, a carbon peak and carbon neutral target, which means that if you're places like Indonesia and India, you want to tread carefully because your product carbon footprint will increasingly become a big part of the attention. So this ultimately only lead to a single conclusion, is that the world will not wait the US to transition, right? Whatever is going to happen within the US border, they can decide it as their decisions, but the rest of the world will not hold on their transition. And China is in a great place to contribute more, both in terms of providing technologies as well as investments. And just one closing point is that as we talk about investments, obviously, not all countries want to import everything from China, which means that China will also need to do a lot of supply chain investment. It's going to be a balancing act, right? Whether countries like Vietnam, Malaysia, or other countries, they want to find that balancing point. Hey, China, can you invest in my countries? But let's do some kind of joint production to make sure that the clean energy belongs to both sides.
And right on cue, this week, Chinese President Xi Jinping is visiting 3 ASEAN countries, Vietnam, Malaysia, and Cambodia. 3 out of the 4 countries hit by last year's US solar panel tariffs. In Vietnam, the first stop on his trip, the 2 countries agreed to deepen cooperation across a range of areas. Notably, clean tech and green development are now part of bilateral projects meant to support economic growth, strengthen supply chains, and boost cross-border trade. They're also planning joint research programs in clean technology and climate adaptation. Like Putra said, no matter what the US hopes to achieve with tariffs or other protectionist policies, the rest of the world isn't hitting pause on clean energy. The trend is clear. Clean tech is moving forward, and no single country or policy or anyone can stop it. A huge thank you to Putra Adiguna of Energy Shift Institute for sharing his insights with us, and thank you for tuning in to this episode of Climate Watch. If you have any questions about climate change or suggestions for future episodes, feel free to reach out to me at fei.fei@cgtn.com, fei.fei@cgtn.com. I'd love to hear from you, and don't forget to subscribe to this podcast on your favorite platform. You can also find me on Substack. I'm writing a newsletter called Rivers and Mountains there. Until next time.